the key thing we wanted to ask is how equitable are existing public policies, both at the national level and the county level. That's what animated us. But one of the things that is important to keep in mind as we try to answer that question, and one of the things we discussed yesterday, is that in order to answer the question how equitable is policy, you have to have a definition, a working definition of equity. And while equity is a core value in the Constitution, and it infuses the Constitution, it's mentioned equitable distribution, equitable proportions. The use of the term equity as a core value is mentioned in the Constitution many, many times. There's no definition which is given for exactly what is it that we mean by equity. And as I said yesterday, if you actually go back to sessional paper number 10, which is usually cited as a paper which was inequitable, which actually led to decades of inequity, it actually uses language about equity as well. It talks about equitable distribution, it talks about equitable redistribution, it talks about marginalized areas. And so it cannot be that we stop the discussion about equity with vague language, with vague references to equity, because that can take us in very different directions, and I think the history of the country already shows that. Therefore, the Constitution gave us the first building block in this conversation about equity by putting equity at the center, by giving us some direction on what it means in terms of gender, in terms of marginalized communities, and so forth. But we still have to answer the question for ourselves. What do we actually mean by equity? When do we consider things to be equitable? And the answer to that question comes only in the application of the terms and ideas to public policy. That's when we actually, that's where the rubber meets the road. And in doing that, one of the things that I really want to emphasize is that we are not just, therefore, able to answer the question, what is equity from a technical perspective, because it's not just a technical question. It's a question of values and principles. And when you talk about values and principles, that means, in a democratic society, justifying the decisions that you're making in terms which people can discuss and debate. Now, these 6 principles of equity are not the only things that one can say about equity. And that is the point I was making earlier, that equity emerges from debate and discussion. There is no one right answer, one technical answer. On the other hand, I also don't want you to think that the principles of equity that we've highlighted are principles that we invented last night before printing these documents, that they are entirely fanciful. They emerge both from global thinking about equity, from literature by philosophers, but also from practical applications and intuition. So, the first principle is the need principle. And this is the most widely understood principle. I have never met anyone in our many discussions around the country or in other places who does not have some appreciation for this principle intuitively. And that is the principle that those who need more should receive more. Now, what that means in practice can be complicated, but we usually think when we're talking about policy that need relates to things like population, for example. If there are more people need more services, therefore they need more funding for services. So that's one way of looking at need. Another way of looking at need is to think about how people have been treated historically. Historical marginalization can yield greater needs. People that were discriminated against in the past have certain gaps, and those gaps need to be filled in order for those people to catch up to other parts of the country. And that's the logic, for example, behind the Equalization Fund in the Constitution. The second principle is capacity. And this principle is a little bit more controversial than need, but also, I think, fairly widely understood. Those who have more should contribute more. Or another way of saying it is those who have more should receive less. The rich should pay more for their own services than the poor, or should receive less from the general pool for those services than the poor would receive. The third principle is effort. And one of the things that we found when we went around the country is that people actually have a hard time with the distinctions between capacity and effort, and exactly where they overlap. And I think the balance between these principles is part of the art of thinking about equity, as opposed to the science. But But effort is basically the idea, which I think again is quite intuitive, that those who make more of an effort to provide for themselves should be rewarded for doing so and not punished. Those who make less of an effort should not be rewarded for that failure to exert themselves on their own behalf. Efficiency is the fourth principle. This is the principle to a certain extent. This is the much maligned principle associated with sessional paper number 10, but I think it is not, there's nothing wrong with it on its own. The question is how you balance it with other principles, and that is the idea that those who use resources well should be rewarded, and those who use resources poorly should receive less. And I think that is also quite intuitive for most of us. But of course the application is where things get sticky. The fifth principle is what is called the basic minimum, or basic minimum shares. And this principle is, again, something that emerges from intuition. And I think there's quite a bit of support. We have some survey data we'll be releasing soon that I think suggests that this principle is actually quite common in Kenya. That whatever the other principles say, I may look at you and assess you according to need and capacity and effort, and I may decide on that basis that you deserve nothing, and that all the money should go someplace else. But the basic minimum says that, well, even if that is the case, you should still get something small. Everybody should get something from the system, and everybody should feel a part of it, even if they don't really need it, or their effort is minimal, or the capacity is high, they should still get something. And I think this principle actually emerged quite a bit in the first discussions around the formula, which we'll return to in the afternoon. And finally, the final principle, which to a certain extent sits above the others, is the principle of fair process. And fair process basically says that it's not just the end, but the means by which we make these decisions. How do we come to a decision about what is fair? And we need this principle, or this principle is widely believed to be important because we have to balance all the other principles. And balancing the other principles is not easy, and there's no technical answer to how we best balance the principles. So you may have somebody who, according to your need principle, should receive the most, but according to your capacity principle, should receive the least. Now what do? The principles run in different directions. So you have to make a call. How do we balance the principles? That's just an example where there are two principles, but you may find all of your principles conflicting. And therefore, because there's no technical answer to this, we have to have an open process, a transparent process, ideally a participatory process, in which we discuss the principles and how to weight them. And that yields some final outcome. And that final outcome, we may not agree. We may not all agree with that final outcome. In fact, it is a central axiom of public policy that it is impossible to find a public policy that everyone agrees with. There's no such public policy. And therefore, what we are looking for is not necessarily the policy that everyone agrees with, but the policy that everyone can accept. Because that policy is based on reasons that everyone can accept as valid reasons. We can look at what the government is doing and saying, I don't agree with this policy, it's not the best policy for me, but it's a reasonable policy, given all of the factors. So, fair process is about getting us to that place, getting us to that point.
So the 6 principles that Jason just mentioned, for those of us who are familiar with the work that IBP has been doing around revenue sharing for a couple of years now, I think we've laid a lot of emphasis that even as we devolve and even as we continue with the functions that are at the national level, we have to constantly think about that process we go through and the principles that we are trying to apply as we share revenues. CDF probably is the most famous, the most controversial fund in Kenya for probably the last 10 years. CDF has a lot of fans, it has a lot of haters, it has a lot of people who don't understand it, but CDF has been a very prominent, I think, fund in Kenya since 2003. And for many of us, I think in the past 2 or 3 years, CDF has been in the high. 75% of CDF is shared equally among our 290 constituencies. So there's a very high weight that is given to that very equal share. So regardless of your poverty rate, regardless of your population, regardless of your land area, regardless of any differences that exist among the constituencies, 75% is shared equally. All right? Then 25% is shared now based on a poverty parameter. So how many poor people live in your constituencies as a share of the total population of poor people in the country. So a quarter of the fund is shared by this criteria. 75 equally, 25% based on poverty. Now, the thinking behind the CDF, and when you look at the CDF Act, there's a lot of talk, I think, around reduction when it comes to poverty. And our understanding, and the understanding that you see when you're going through that act, is that CDF has a big leaning towards capital expenditure development. And that's what CDF is known for, brick and mortar, build, right? But of course, there are other things that CDF money is used for. Social welfare, and here I'm speaking mostly about bursaries. We all know about the bursaries that CDF has to fund. The Act also does give CDF the leeway for funding activities around sports, and also some environmental aspects as well. So how fair is the distribution mechanism itself? Now, the first thing you notice is that CDF being a capital, being mostly a capital fund, and at the same time funding some of those social welfare, like the bursaries, is that in the criteria that I just mentioned, there are no direct measures that are supposed to pick out the need in some of those issues that CDF is supposed to fund. For example, in a natural setting, you would expect that we would want to know how many kids across the constituencies are in need of bursaries. Then you want to share your resources based on that kind of criteria. CDF does not have those kind of direct measures. Even when it comes to the infrastructure, the development that we all know of, CDF in its criteria, as you see, does not in any way try to identify what are the infrastructure gaps. The second concept of need that Jason was speaking to. What are the infrastructure deficits that exist in the constituencies? Then we target that a bit more through the allocations that we give each of the constituencies. So that is one of the main things that you notice about CDF. Very high equal share, and even the 25% that is shared equitably based on poverty, it does not directly address the issues that CDF is going towards funding. Now, I want to use an example that I think will probably put this case properly. Mandera South is the constituency in the country with the highest number of poor people. And Lamu East is the constituency with the lowest number of poor people. Now, when you look at the distribution in 2015-2016, in terms of the allocation that each of these, the two constituencies got, the per capita allocation for those poor people, remember that 25% is going to poor people. So I'm trying as much as possible to target that and see how equitable this could be, even based on the criteria that CDF has. Is that Lamu East receives over 20 times more than Mandera South. Okay? This is to say that, I think, if I remember the numbers correctly, per poor person, Lamu East, I think, gets about 35,000 shillings. It's just slightly above that. And Mandera South, it's slightly below, or it's just around 1,000 shillings. So what is driving that huge inequality when it comes to the actual allocation is the big equal share that you see. So politically, when you share things equally, it looks nice. True or not true? It's very easy to say, kila mtu apatiwe shilingi 10. Right? But that political agreement is not really helping us sort out the inequalities that exist in the constituencies. And that's the reason why the constituency that you can think of, poverty in terms of the actual number of poor people, is receiving way much less than a constituency that has about 2,000 poor people. That's Lamu East. So there is a lot of discussion that we should have when it comes to CDF, and whether CDF is actually addressing poverty by meeting the need in each of the constituencies. The high equal share is not helping us get there. The level 5 hospitals. As I say, when we devolved, there was a big discussion about what to do with the former provincial hospitals. The provincial hospitals were regional hospitals because they serve more than one county. And an agreement was reached that these facilities should be managed by the host counties. So if you have the Rift Valley General Hospital, then it will be managed by Nakuru County. However, because of that regional aspect, we are going to give them a conditional grant to make sure that they are able to provide services beyond their county. Because remember, you're giving money to one county. You don't want to burden it with the facility and not help it cater for other people who visited from counties that are beyond their borders. Now, this is, so this includes the 7 provincial hospitals that we had. Nairobi did not have a provincial hospital. And it also includes 4 other high-volume facilities. These are facilities that had big catchment areas. They were not provincial hospitals, but like Thika Level 5 is one of those. That was not a provincial hospital, but its catchment area is beyond Kiambu County. Now, before we devolved, this was the criteria that we were using to distribute resources among provincial hospitals. So we would look at the poverty within the area where they are, the number of beds that are utilized, outpatient cases, accident-prone facilities. So this speaks about emergency cost and fuel costs as well. So that's one of those that looked at operational cost. So what happened after devolution? In 2013, 2014, and 2014, 2015, if you look at the Division of Revenue and the County Allocation of Revenue Act, it was not very clear what criteria you are using. You are just seeing facilities and the allocations to each of the facilities. But something nice happened in 2015, 2016, and in the Division of Revenue, Treasury included a bit more information on exactly how those allocations going to the facilities were arrived at. And surprisingly, it was only based on bed occupancy rates. All right? If you have 100 beds and 75% of them on average are occupied throughout the year, then your occupancy rate is 75%. Okay? So it is that rate, the percentage, is what was actually used to distribute resources in 2015-2016. And in 2016-2017, that is the same criteria that has been used. So the higher the rate you have, the more money you get. For example, you can see Kakamega here with 88%. If you look at the allocations, it's 4 billion shillings. And if you just run through, I'm not sure everyone can see this, but I'll read it for you. The highest allocation is 407 million shillings, which goes to Kakamega. The lowest, I believe, is Embu with 62%, and the allocation is 287. And if you look across that column, it's the lowest. So the higher your occupancy rate as a percentage, the higher you get. The lower you get. How equitable is that? Now, first of all, the bed occupancy rate completely ignores the number of beds you have. Because we know for sure that all these facilities don't have the same number of beds. Okay? So 88% in Kakamega means something very different to another facility. 88% in Kakamega is not 88% in Thika Level 5. And I want to use an example of Nakuru and Meru. Nakuru and Meru, so you can see Meru is 77% and Nakuru is 77% as well. Now, if you come to the allocation, both facilities receive 356 million shillings. Okay? So you can see how the occupancy rate is determining how much money you get. How many beds does Nakuru have? So here is the bed capacity in those facilities. Nakuru is 588 beds, okay? And Meru is 306 beds. So 77% means very different things in the two facilities. Because what you fund is not percentages. If there is somebody on a bed, the cost is that person on that bed. Okay? So the more beds you have, the more expensive your 77% is. True? All right. Now, so that is the amounts that, and actually, so this was in the County Allocation of Revenue Bill, and when the Act was passed, the amounts remained the same. So that is the criteria that we actually use. And to me, the most shocking thing is that this thing has passed in the Senate twice. In 2015, 2016, that passed in the Senate. And to be very fair, IBP was there and we made a presentation about this, but it still went through. In 2016, 2017, the same criteria came. This table that I have, the only thing I added, I think, is just the bed capacity in these facilities. But this is a table that went through the Senate, and it was still approved. But you can see how unfair that criteria is, especially to the facilities that have more beds. Okay? So Meru, which, if you now apply the 77%, their average beds occupied in Meru is 236, and Nakuru is 453, almost twice the size. But both of them are getting the same allocation. Okay? So this approach that we're using in the distribution of the level 5 conditional grant is really not that fair. I believe there's a huge learning platform in what Elgeyo has done that other counties can learn from. So Elgeyo Marakwet passed an act in their county assembly that was to guide the distribution of their development budget across their 20 wards. 60% of the development budget for each department is to be shared equally among the 20 wards. Notice the step. It's not just the block development. It is the development budget for each department. Okay? So if it's the health department, your development budget 60% is distributed across the wards, and then 40% is shared based on a formula that was borrowed from the CRA. So these are the parameters in that, they call it the EDA, so it's the Equitable Development Act. So the 40% for each of the departments is shared based on the population of the ward. There are projects that are cross-cutting, they're not just within the wards. So there are projects that are cross-cutting in the county, so there is a weight to them. There is the poverty, there is land area, there are emergencies, and there is fiscal responsibility as well. Okay, so this is one case where you have a different principle coming into play. So this is effort, probably that's a big step. And of course, there's one which I thought was, which is one which the CRA did not have, but Elgeyo felt was important for them, which is the arid and semi-arid areas. So if you know Elgeyo, Marakwet, and the gentleman from Elgeyo can correct me, I think the northern side of Elgeyo is quite dry, and the southern side is where it's more green. So these are the parameters and the weights that Elgeyo Marakwet is using to distribute resources among their wards. It was interesting to see Elgeyo trying a different model. And that's why I said I think for Elgeyo, it's for us to learn about what they've done. And one thing that you notice about, let's just go back. One thing you noticed about the Elgeyo weights is Elgeyo seems to be more distributive even than the CRA formula. The distribution criteria in Elgeyo kind of locked out resources that would then go into these county-wide projects. Wards that are, projects that are not just targeted at certain wards. And Elgeyo, one of the things that they've been trying to do, and I believe this has is one of the learning points for us, is that they've had to kind of rethink this formula when it comes to the actual distribution, because they realized that that very huge equal distribution and the requirement that the rest of the 40 still has to be distributed in a big way to each of the wards locked out a lot of money, that could go into some of these county-wide projects. And I think as the adjustments are made, one of the things that is good to do for the process part is to think about making this information public so that people understand why is the formula not working, like it should, is because the county has made some adjustments. And those adjustments then be made clear so that the process can be seen to be fair.
What are the reasons we give for the choices we make? What are the reasons the county governments are giving us for the decisions that are made in the budget process? This research, as you've heard, has been done for a very, very long time, but the main thing we wanted to find out is, and for the sake of accountability, when we look at key budget documents, are we able to tell, first of all, where our money is going and why our money is going where it's going, all right? So we're looking for public reasons, which are reasons for choices made that are acceptable to a reasonable citizen. And we also focused on 3 counties, that is Elgeyo, Marakwet, Nakuru, and Kisumu, where we looked at the entire development budget to understand how are they distributing resources. And I want to say that we only looked at the development budget and not the recurrent expenditure. But this is because it's easier to track development expenditure, but we also are aware that certain services like health are very recurrent expenditure heavy. So this research is limited to that extent, but we looked at the development expenditure for the water sector and the larger entire development budget for these 3 counties. It's very difficult to get this budget document, and as you can see, I couldn't get most of the ADPs, but I got the budget estimates and the CIDPs. Of these documents, I tried to look at which are they telling us where resources are going. So do we have locations for projects, and do we have the cost estimate? All right, and I found that in most budget estimates, we don't have this kind of information. All right. So we know we're going to try and immunize children, but we don't know where, all right? We know we're going to drill boreholes, but we don't know where. And I'm thinking as a Mwananchi, fine, we've said we're going to drill 47 boreholes in Nakuru, but where exactly are these boreholes being drilled? And how can I follow up? And how much is being used for each borehole? This kind of information is conspicuously missing from our budget documents, which I think is a problem in when you look at it from an accountability perspective and a transparency perspective, that we're not able to follow where the money is going. In as much as we know the overall objective of why we're spending, we don't have an idea of the a common Mwananchi would understand, and I would understand, we need water, all right? What are we doing to get water? We're drilling boreholes. However, if you don't tell me where boreholes are being drilled, I'll be sitting in Ward A thinking, maybe they're drilling in Ward B, and then water is going to be piped here, you know? Or maybe they're drilling all of them in Ward A, and because Ward A looks like it has more water, you know? But you're not supposed to be put in that situation, because this government document should be able to tell you this is where we are locating our project, and this is how much we have estimated for the same, so we can follow it up and ensure that actually these boreholes are being drilled. Let's take not the most recent, but the budget estimates for 2015-16. Only 6 counties gave reasons of their distribution. All right, so, and it's the generic criteria. Usually the forward is written, or the acknowledgement is written by the governor, and he says in that forward that this document was prepared after extensive consultative forums and public participation, and that is how we did this document. However, you cannot link this. Say, for example, the public participation reports, they are not available. So when you look at the budget, they're saying all these projects were from a public participation forum. But if you want to know if they're actually from that public participation forum, again, I will have to go for my road trip to find out where exactly were these public participations, and what did people say, what didn't make to the budget, and what made to the budget, and what were the reasons of selecting a few projects, because obviously not all projects that are proposed get to make to the budget documents. These are some of the reasons that are in our budget documents as the reasons behind our distribution. Most of the documents say that they prepared the budget, or the distribution was informed by the CIDPs or the ADPs. And I'll take one example, Baringo County. All the ADPs indicate that they prepared the documents borrowing heavily from their CIDPs. However, at the time I was doing my research, which was until until 2015-16, the CIDP for Baringo wasn't available to me and to people from Baringo. So when you tell me you've gotten the projects from a CIDP which is not available even to the people in Baringo, then what are you telling me? That's an inadequate reason. And then again, the other one would be public participation and consultative forums. But most budget documents do not even have an annex or in their website where they've said, oh, this is what we got from the public, and this is why some of the projects got there and some didn't, because we expect that there are reasons, all right? Like, it is impossible to drill a borehole where the water table is too low or something like that. But we have no document or reference point to know who suggested what. For example, like in Kirinyaga and Nyandarua, they had their public participation reports online and I was able to get them. However, the structure of the budget doesn't, in the first place, give the distribution. So in as much as we have what people wanted them to do, it is not indicated in the budget that they picked whatever people proposed, all right? And then another reason that is given is that strategic plans and sector plans were used to inform distribution. These plans are not available either. And the time I went to like Nakuru and Elgeyo Marakwet, there were draft plans. So maybe they should have indicated draft plans, I don't know. But it's impossible to tell if really the projects are from these plans. And then I noticed in other budget documents, there's a special attention to urban areas. However, I do not know why the county arrived at the figures they're giving to urban areas. For example, Garissa and Lamu. Under the PFM Act, there is a criteria on how to distribute resources to urban areas. And it's not mandatory because it uses the usual legal language, may use this criteria, but it's something for councils to think about, that when you're distributing resources to urban areas, and this is a problem that was pointed out in Nakuru and Elgeyo Marakwet, that in as much as we're distributing resources to all wards, there are particular areas that require more, like town areas and urban areas, and the suggested criteria would be probably a basic minimum, which Jason talked about earlier, price differentials, revenue collection, poverty levels. But this is not referred to any budget document. However, it's a good place to start. Another reason, which you will agree with me is quite absurd, lists from MCAs and World Development Fund projects. This was in a budget entitled Taveta, where it has a section saying this is a list from MCAs. And probably the MCA got information from the public. I don't know. Probably the MCA did a feasibility study and this is the list they have brought. They think the county can move in this direction. But just telling us that you've included projects in the budget because you were given a list by an MCA, I don't think it's sufficient justification for a project to make it to the budget because an MCA came and signed against a list and thus you've adopted it, all right? And that's also the case in Kisumu. I was doing an interview and the lady there told me, look, these MCAs are giving us headache. So what we've decided, we will print out a list and they will come and sign and this is the list we're going to use so that they don't come back in the middle of the year and tell us we want different projects, all right? So the question is, what informs this list from MCAs that you have to hold them accountable and tell them these are yours and we're going to do them, all right? An inadequate criteria, I would say. And then when you look at other documents, there's an attempt to give the criteria they used in distribution. For example, in Busia, and I'm glad Busia CBF members are here. So for Busia, for 2014, they said distribution would be according to demand, community involvement, participation, distribution pattern of already developed systems. You can all help me understand that. First of all, this department, the water department, is being given, like, here is 20 million, and this is you go and decide, but this is roughly what you should take into consideration, and we actually don't even have a mechanism of making sure you take into consideration distribution patterns of already developed systems, all right? It's ridiculous, you know, like, this cannot be a reason for distributing. And anyway, why are you giving the water department that kind of discretion? It's too wide, no one can hold them to account. If they came and told you it was demanded, then what else could you tell them? They demanded for a borehole in just one ward. The other ones did not demand, you know?